I've been avoiding shadow people stories because honestly, they're the one type of paranormal encounter that still gives me chills. There's something about these dark figures that feels more real, more present than traditional ghosts. But these 3 submissions were too compelling to ignore. Shadow people are different from other paranormal phenomena. They're not translucent spirits or fleeting apparitions. They're solid, dark figures that seem to absorb light rather than reflect it. They move with purpose, they watch with intelligence, and most disturbing of all, they seem to be aware that you can see them. Tonight, as 3 stories come from people who encountered these beings in the most ordinary places, at home, at work, during routine moments when they least expected to come face to face with something that shouldn't exist. What you're about to hear will make you look twice at every shadow, every dark corner, every space where light doesn't quite reach. This story comes from Isabella, a 28-year-old graphic designer who lived alone in a second-floor apartment in Austin, Texas. She thought the long hallway in her apartment was just poorly lit until she realized someone was using it as their personal observation post. I'd been living in my apartment for about 8 months when I first saw him. The apartment was perfect for me. Good natural light from my home studio, quiet neighborhood, reasonable rent. The only weird thing was the hallway that connected my bedroom to the rest of the apartment. It was longer than necessary and had no windows, so it stayed dark even during the day unless I turned on the overhead light. I'm not someone who's afraid of the dark, so I usually just navigated the hallway by memory, especially at night when I didn't want to wake myself up with bright lights. That's probably why it took so long for me to notice him. The first time I saw the shadow figure, I was getting up for water around 2 a.m. I stepped out of my bedroom and immediately felt like someone was watching me. When I looked down the hallway toward the living room, I saw what looked like a man standing perfectly, still about halfway down the corridor. He was completely black, like a human-shaped hole in the darkness, but somehow darker than the surrounding shadows. I could see his outline clearly. Average height, wearing what looked like a long coat or jacket, standing with his hands at his sides. I froze, staring at this figure, trying to decide if I was seeing things or if someone had broken into my apartment. After about 10 seconds, I reached for the hallway light switch. The moment my hand touched the switch, the figure moved. Not quickly, not in a startled way, but deliberately. He turned and walked deeper into the apartment, toward my living room, moving with a smooth, gliding motion that didn't look quite natural. I flipped on the light, and the hallway was empty. I grabbed a baseball bat and searched every inch of my apartment. All the doors were locked. All the windows were secure. Nothing was missing or disturbed. But I knew what I'd seen. I convinced myself it was just my imagination, a trick of shadows and sleepiness. Until it happened again. 3 nights later, same time, same situation. I stepped out of my bedroom, and there he was, standing in the exact same spot in the hallway. This time, I didn't reach for the light switch. I wanted to observe him, to figure out what I was really looking at. The shadow figure stood perfectly motionless for about 30 seconds. Then, very slowly, he turned his head toward me. I couldn't see facial features. He was just a dark silhouette, but I could feel him looking directly at me. That's when I realized this wasn't a trick of light or my imagination. This was an intelligent being, and it was aware of my presence just as much as I was aware of its. I spoke to it. "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure tilted its head slightly, like it was considering my questions. Then it raised one arm and pointed down the hallway toward my living room. I followed its gesture, looking where it was pointing, and when I looked back, it was gone. This became a regular occurrence. Every few nights, usually around 2 a.m., the shadow figure would be standing in my hallway. Sometimes it would just observe me. Other times it would gesture toward different parts of the apartment, like it was trying to show me something. I started keeping a journal, documenting each encounter. The figure appeared 23 times over the course of 2 months. It never seemed threatening, just ... watchful, curious maybe. But then the interactions became more direct. I was working late in my home studio one night when I felt that familiar sensation of being watched. I looked up from my computer and saw the shadow figure standing in the doorway of my studio. This was the first time I'd seen it outside the hallway. "You're getting bolder," I said to it, surprised by how normal it felt to be having a conversation with a shadow. The figure stepped into the room, actually stepped, with visible foot movement. It approached my desk and pointed at my computer screen, where I had a client's logo design open. I looked at the design, then back at the figure. "You want to see what I'm working on?" The shadow figure nodded. An actual, visible nod. Over the next hour, the strangest thing happened. The shadow figure watched me work, occasionally pointing at different elements of the design. When I made changes it seemed to approve of, it would nod. When I tried something it didn't like, it would shake its head or gesture in a different direction. I found myself explaining my design choices out loud, and the figure would respond with body language that felt surprisingly communicative. It had opinions about color choices, layout decisions, even font selections. "Are you some kind of artist?" I asked. The figure paused, then slowly nodded yes. "Are you dead?" Another pause, then another nod. "Did you die in this apartment?" This time, the figure shook its head and pointed toward the window, then made a gesture that seemed to indicate out there, somewhere else in the building or neighborhood. Over the next few weeks, my shadow person became a regular presence in my life. He'd appear during my late-night work sessions, silently observing and occasionally offering input on my projects. I started calling him Marcus. It seemed like a name that fit his thoughtful, artistic personality. But then I learned something that changed everything. I was having coffee with my downstairs neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, and mentioned that I sometimes felt like someone was watching me in my apartment. "Oh, honey," she said, looking concerned. "You might want to know about the previous tenant in your unit." My stomach dropped. "What about him?" "His name was Marcus. He was a graphic designer, just like you. Very talented, very quiet. He lived in your apartment for about 5 years. What happened to him?" Mrs. Patterson's expression grew sad. "He died right here in the building. Heart attack in the stairwell. He was coming home late from work, carrying a portfolio of his designs. They found him on the landing between the first and second floor." I felt chills run down my spine. "When did this happen?" "About a year ago. The apartment stayed empty for months before you moved in. I think Marcus was having trouble finding work, getting his career started. He was very passionate about his art, but the stress of trying to make it as a freelancer was getting to him. That evening, when Marcus appeared in my hallway, I approached him differently. 'Marcus?' I said softly. 'Is that your name?' The figure straightened up, like he was surprised to be recognized. 'Mrs. Patterson told me what happened. I'm sorry you died before you got to fulfill your dreams as an artist.' Marcus stood very still for a long moment. Then he walked to my living room and pointed at the wall where I'd hung several of my own design pieces. I understood. 'You want to see your work displayed too?' He nodded enthusiastically. The next day, I contacted Mrs. Patterson and asked if she knew what had happened to Marcus's art portfolio. She said his sister had taken most of his belongings, but she had kept some of his work that had been scattered in the stairwell when he died. When I saw Marcus's designs, I understood why he'd been so interested in my work. He was incredibly talented, with a style that was both innovative and emotionally resonant. These weren't just graphics, they were art. I had several of his pieces professionally framed and hung them alongside my own work. That night, when Marcus appeared, I led him to the wall display. The shadow figure stood in front of his framed designs for several minutes, perfectly still. Then he turned to me, and for the first time since I'd been seeing him, he seemed less dark, less solid. I could almost see through him. He raised his hand in what looked like a gesture of gratitude, then slowly faded away. I never saw Marcus again after that night. The hallway stayed empty. The feeling of being watched disappeared, and my apartment felt different, lighter somehow. But I kept his artwork on my wall. His designs inspired me to push my own creative boundaries, to take risks with my art that I might not have taken otherwise. 6 months later, I landed the biggest client of my career, partly because my portfolio had evolved to include some of the innovative techniques I'd learned from studying Marcus's work. Marcus taught me that artistic passion doesn't end with death, and sometimes the most meaningful collaborations happen between people who never actually meet in life. His work is still hanging on my wall, and sometimes when I'm struggling with a design problem, I look at his pieces and remember the shadow figure who just wanted his art to be seen and appreciated. Maybe that's all any artist really wants, to know that their work mattered, that their vision touched someone else's life. Marcus got that recognition even after death. And in helping him find peace, I discovered a deeper connection to my own creativity that I carry with me in every project I take on. This story comes from Raj, a 32-year-old IT specialist who worked late shifts at a corporate office building in Seattle. He discovered that the building's security system included a guard that wasn't on the official payroll. I've always been a night owl, so when my company offered me a position on the late shift IT support team, I jumped at the chance. Better pay, fewer interruptions, and I got to work in peace while the building was mostly empty. The Cascade building was one of those modern downtown office towers, glass and steel, 40 stories, housing dozens of different companies. My shift ran from 6 p.m. to 2 a.m., and most nights, I was one of only a handful of people in the entire building. The IT support office was on the 23rd floor, and my job was to handle server maintenance, process overnight data transfers, and respond to any technical emergencies. Most nights were routine, but I enjoyed the solitude and the view of the city lights. I'd been working there for about 3 months when I started noticing something odd during my security rounds. Part of my job was to check the server rooms on different floors, making sure everything was running properly and that all the access doors were secure. These rounds took me through empty office spaces, past dark cubicles and conference rooms, down corridors that were lit only by emergency lighting. On the 31st floor, there was a long corridor that connected 2 sets of server rooms. It was one of those institutional hallways, fluorescent lights, generic carpet, nothing distinctive about it. But every time I walked down that corridor, I had the strangest feeling that someone was walking behind me. I'd hear footsteps that matched my pace exactly, staying about 10 feet back. When I'd slow down, the footsteps would slow down. When I'd speed up, they'd speed up. But when I'd turn around, the corridor behind me was always empty. At first, I thought it was just an echo, my own footsteps bouncing off the walls in weird ways. But the building was well designed acoustically, and I'd never experienced anything like this in other corridors. After this happened several times, I decided to test it. I stopped abruptly in the middle of the corridor and listened carefully. The footsteps behind me stopped too, but not immediately. There was a slight delay, like someone who'd been following me had taken one extra step before realizing I'd stopped. "Hello?" I called out into the empty hallway. No response, but I could feel a presence behind me, like someone was standing there listening. I turned around slowly, and that's when I saw him for the first time. About 15 feet behind me, standing perfectly still in the middle of the corridor, was a figure that looked like a man-shaped shadow. He was completely black, but somehow more solid than the surrounding darkness. I could make out his general shape. Average height, wearing what looked like a suit or uniform, standing with perfect posture. We stared at each other for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. Then I blinked, and he was gone. I spent the rest of that shift questioning my sanity, But the next night, during my security round, the same thing happened. Footsteps following me down the 31st floor corridor, and when I turned around, there was the shadow figure standing silently behind me. This became our routine. Every night, the shadow figure would follow me during my 31st floor rounds. He never got closer than about 15 feet, never made any threatening moves, just accompanied me. I started calling him my shadow partner and began talking to him during the walks. Another quiet night, I'd say, and I swear I could feel him listening. Server room A is running a bit warm tonight. Might need to adjust the cooling system. The shadow figure never responded vocally, but his presence felt attentive, like he was genuinely interested in my work. After about 2 weeks of this routine, something happened that made me realize my shadow partner was more than just a curious observer. I was working in one of the server rooms when I heard the unmistakable sound of someone trying to force open a door. It was coming from somewhere else on the 31st floor, and it definitely wasn't a normal building sound. I grabbed my radio to call building security, but before I could make the call, I felt a presence beside me. I looked up and saw my shadow figure standing right next to my workstation, the closest he'd ever been to me. He raised his arm and pointed toward the corridor, then made a gesture that clearly meant, "Follow me." I followed him out of the server room and down the hallway. He led me to a section of the floor I rarely visited, where some of the offices were leased to smaller companies. One of the office doors was slightly open, and I could see light from a flashlight moving around inside. Someone was definitely in there. Who shouldn't be? My shadow partner stopped about 10 feet from the door and turned to look at me. Even though I couldn't see facial features, I could sense he was trying to communicate something important. I called building security and reported a break-in on the 31st floor. While I waited for them to arrive, I stayed in the corridor, and my shadow partner stayed with me, positioned between me and the office where the intruder was working. When security arrived, they found a man with a laptop trying to access one of the company's computer systems. He'd bypassed the building's security and was attempting corporate espionage. The security chief later told me that if the intruder had succeeded in accessing those systems, it could have cost the company millions in stolen data and trade secrets. "How did you know to check that office?" he asked me. I couldn't exactly say. My shadow friend told me. So I made up something about hearing unusual sounds during my rounds. But I knew the truth. My shadow partner had guided me to the intruder, had essentially protected the building and everyone who worked there. After that night, my relationship with the shadow figure changed. He was no longer just a mysterious presence. He was an ally, a guardian who watched over the building during the vulnerable night hours. I started researching the building's history and learned something interesting. 5 years earlier, there had been a security guard named David Walsh who'd worked the night shift in the Cascade building. According to the records, David had died of a heart attack while on duty, found at his desk in the security office on the morning shift. David had been known for his dedication to the job, for knowing every inch of the building and taking personal responsibility for keeping it safe. I became convinced that my shadow partner was David, still doing his job even after death. To test this theory, I started talking to him differently during our nightly rounds. "Thanks for the help with that break-in, David," I said one night as we walked down the 31st floor corridor. The shadow figure stopped walking. He turned toward me and for the first time, nodded clearly in acknowledgement. "You're still protecting this building, aren't you?" Another nod. "Do you need help with anything? Is there something keeping you here?" The shadow figure was still for a long moment. Then he started walking again, but this time he led me to a different part of the building. We went down several floors to the security office where David had died. The room was now used for storage, but there was still an old desk against one wall. The shadow figure approached the desk and pointed at one of the drawers. I opened the drawer and found a collection of personal items that had obviously been left behind when David died, family photos, a coffee mug, a small notebook. At the bottom of the drawer was an envelope with "For my family" written on the outside. Inside the envelope was a letter David had written to his wife and children, expressing his love for them and his regrets about working so many night shifts that kept him away from home. He'd apparently written it during one of his last shifts, but never had the chance to give it to them. "You want me to make sure your family gets this letter?" I asked. The shadow figure nodded emphatically. I researched David's family and found his widow still living in the Seattle area. I called her and explained that I'd found some of her husband's belongings while working in the building where he died. She was grateful and agreed to meet me. When I gave her the letter, she broke down crying. She said David had been struggling with depression before his death, feeling guilty about missing so many family dinners and school events because of his work schedule. The letter gave her closure she'd been seeking for years. He loved his job, she told me, but he loved us more. This letter proves that. Thank you for bringing it to me. The next night, when I went to the 31st floor for my security rounds, I walked the corridor alone. My shadow partner was gone, but I didn't feel abandoned. I felt like David had finally been able to complete his most important task, not protecting the building, but protecting his family's understanding of how much they meant to him. I continued working the night shift at the Cascade building for 2 more years, and I never saw David again. But sometimes, during particularly quiet nights, when I was walking through the empty corridors, I'd say, "Thanks, David," to the darkness, just in case he was still listening. Because I learned that some people take their responsibilities so seriously that even death can't make them abandon their post. David taught me that being a guardian isn't just about watching over buildings or systems. It's about watching over the people and connections that matter most. And sometimes, the most important security work happens not in preventing break-ins, but in making sure love and forgiveness can break through the barriers that separate us from the people we care about. Our final story comes from Zoe, a 26-year-old nurse who lived with her boyfriend in a small house in rural North Carolina. She learned that some shadow people aren't content to just observe. Some of them want to make contact in more direct ways. Tyler and I had been living together for about a year when we bought our first house. It was a small 1960s ranch in the countryside, about 20 minutes from the hospital where I worked. We loved the privacy, the big yard, and the fact that we could actually afford the mortgage on our combined salaries. The house needed some work, but it had good bones and a cozy feel. The previous owners had been an elderly couple who'd lived there for decades, and they'd taken good care of the property. We'd been in the house for about 6 weeks when I started waking up in the middle of the night with the feeling that someone was in our bedroom. At first, I assumed it was Tyler getting up to use the bathroom or get water, but when I'd look over, he'd be sound asleep beside me. The feeling would persist for a few minutes, then gradually fade away. This happened several times over the course of 2 weeks, always between 3 and 4 a.m. I'd wake up feeling like someone was standing near the bed, watching us sleep. But when I'd turn on the bedside lamp, the room would be empty. Tyler is a heavy sleeper, so he never woke up during these episodes. I didn't want to worry him with what might just be new house anxiety, so I kept the experiences to myself. But then I actually saw the shadow figure. I woke up around 3:30 a.m. with that familiar feeling of being watched. This time, instead of immediately reaching for the light, I lay still and let my eyes adjust to the darkness. Standing at the foot of our bed was a figure that looked like a tall man, completely black against the dim light coming through our bedroom window. He was perfectly still, and even though I couldn't make out any facial features, I could tell he was looking directly at me. My heart was pounding, but something about his posture didn't seem threatening. He wasn't looming or menacing. He was just present, watching. I whispered, "Who are you?" The figure tilted his head slightly, like he was surprised I could see him. "What do you want?" I asked, still whispering so I wouldn't wake Tyler. The shadow figure raised his hand and pointed at me, then pointed at himself, then made a gesture toward the bedroom door. I interpreted this as me out there, like he wanted me to follow him. Every instinct told me not to get out of bed and follow a shadow figure through my house in the middle of the night. But there was something about his demeanor that felt more sad than scary, more lonely than threatening. I carefully got out of bed, grabbed my robe, and followed the shadow figure out of the bedroom. He led me down the hallway to the living room, moving with that same gliding motion I'd noticed other people describe. When we reached the living room, he stopped near the fireplace and pointed at the mantel. On the mantel were some items the previous owners had left behind. A few books, some decorative objects, and an old photo album that we hadn't bothered to look through yet. The shadow figure pointed specifically at the photo album. I opened it and began flipping through pages of family photos spanning several decades. Near the middle of the album, I found photos of a tall man who looked to be in his 40s or 50s, standing with the elderly couple who'd sold us the house. "Is this you?" I asked the shadow figure. He nodded. I looked more closely at the photos. The man appeared in pictures spanning about 10 years, always with the elderly couple, often doing yard work or home improvement projects. In some photos, he was clearly living in the house. There were pictures of him cooking in our kitchen, relaxing in our living room. "Were you their son?" I asked. The shadow figure nodded again, then pointed to himself and made a gesture across his throat. "You died?" Another nod. Then he pointed to the bedroom where Tyler and I had been sleeping. "You died in our bedroom?" He nodded, then sat down heavily in the chair near the fireplace. Even as a shadow figure, I could see the weight of sadness in his posture. I sat on the couch across from him, still holding the photo album. "What's your name?" He couldn't speak, but he pointed to one of the photos where someone had written on the back. I turned it over and saw Robert helping Dad with the deck, summer 2019. "Robert," I said, and he straightened up at hearing his name. Over the next hour, using yes and no questions and gestures, I learned Robert's story. He had been the caretaker for his elderly parents, living with them in their later years to help with daily tasks and medical needs. He'd never married, had devoted his life to taking care of his parents. When his father died, Robert had continued living in the house with his mother. When she went into assisted living, Robert had stayed in the house alone, unable to afford to maintain it, but unwilling to sell the family home. He died of a heart attack in the bedroom, and his body hadn't been found for several days. His mother had been the one to eventually check on him when he didn't answer his phone. "You've been here since then?" I asked. Robert nodded, then gestured around the room like he was indicating the whole house. "This was your home for a long time." Another nod, and I could sense his attachment to the place. "Are we bothering you by being here?" Robert shook his head quickly, then pointed at Tyler and me, and made a gesture that seemed to indicate protection or caring. I realized that Robert wasn't haunting us. He was watching over us, the same way he'd watched over his parents. "You're making sure we're safe?" He nodded enthusiastically, and for the first time, his presence felt comforting rather than unsettling. "Robert, you don't have to take care of us. We're okay on our own. Don't you want to move on? Find peace?" Robert was still for a long moment, then he pointed to the photo album and to himself, then made a gesture that seemed to indicate confusion or being lost. I understood. Robert had spent so many years taking care of other people that he didn't know how to exist without that purpose. Even in death, he was trying to fulfill the same role. "What if we helped you figure out how to rest?" I asked. "What if we made sure your parents knew how much you loved them and how well you took care of them?" Robert leaned forward, suddenly very attentive. I spent the next few days researching Robert's family. I found his mother in an assisted living facility about an hour away. When I called her, I explained that Tyler and I had bought her house and found some family photos and mementos that might have been left behind accidentally. When I visited her, I brought the photo album and some of Robert's other personal items we'd found in the house. She was incredibly grateful, and we spent several hours looking through the photos together. Robert was such a good son, she told me, tears in her eyes. He gave up his whole life to take care of his father and me. I always worried that he sacrificed too much for us. He loved you very much, I assured her. Anyone could see that from these photos. I miss him terribly, she said. I just hope he knows how grateful I was for everything he did. That night, when Robert appeared in our bedroom, I was ready for him. I visited your mother today, I told him. She wanted me to tell you something. Robert moved closer, more interested than I'd ever seen him. She said to tell you that she loves you, that she's grateful for everything you did for her and your father, and that she wants you to rest now. She wants you to stop worrying about taking care of everyone else and find peace. Robert stood perfectly still for several minutes. Then, slowly, he began to change. His solid shadow form started to become more transparent, and I could see what looked like relief in his posture. He walked to the bed where Tyler was sleeping and gently touched Tyler's forehead, a blessing or protection. Then he came to my side of the bed and did the same for me. "Thank you," he whispered, and I could actually hear his voice for the first time, soft and grateful. Then he walked to the bedroom door, turned back once to wave goodbye, and faded away. I never saw Robert again, but I kept some of his photos on our mantel, and I made sure to visit his mother regularly until she passed away 2 years later. She always asked about the house, and I always told her that Robert had taken good care of it and that we felt his love in every room. Robert taught me that some people love so deeply and care so completely that even death can't break those bonds. But he also taught me that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is permission to stop carrying the weight of responsibility and find peace. Our house feels warm and protected, not because it's haunted, but because it was home to someone who understood that love means taking care of the people and places that matter most. And sometimes, when Tyler and I are lying in bed at night, I whisper, "Thank you, Robert," to the darkness, because I know that somewhere he's finally resting, knowing that his love and care made a difference that lasted beyond his lifetime. These 3 stories remind us that shadow people aren't just mysterious figures lurking in dark corners. They're often individuals with purpose, intelligence, and unfinished business that keeps them tethered to our world. Isabella learned that artistic passion can transcend death, and that sometimes collaboration happens in the most unexpected ways. Raj discovered that dedication and protection can continue even beyond the grave, and that sometimes the most important security work involves the heart. And Zoe found that love and caregiving can create bonds so strong that death itself can't break them. The next time you see a shadow in your peripheral vision, or feel like someone is watching you in an empty space, remember these stories. Not all shadow people are there to frighten or harm. Sometimes they're artists looking for recognition, guardians doing their job, or caregivers who need permission to finally rest. Shadow people exist in the spaces between light and darkness, between our world and whatever comes next. And maybe, just maybe, they're there to teach us that consciousness, purpose, and love don't end when our physical bodies do. Thanks for listening, and remember, the shadows around you might not be empty. They might be full of stories, memories, and connections that refuse to fade away. And sometimes, the most profound encounters happen not in the light, but in the spaces where darkness meets understanding.